Pranam Maharaj.
Namaskar,
Welcome
Yeah.
to Vedanta Society of New York, our special guest lectures. Allow me to kindly introduce you, Maharaj. Revered Swami Tattwamayananda ji is a senior monk of the Ramakrishna order. He is currently the minister in charge of the Vedanta Society of Northern California, San Francisco. He has served in various centers of the Ramakrishna order in India as editor, publisher, and teacher of Sanskrit and Indian philosophy before coming to the United States in January 2012. And over in India, he has taught Sanskrit, Advaitic texts such as Sri Shankaracharya's commentaries on the Prasthanatraya and Indian philosophy. And of course, he was posted at the training center in Belur Math, the headquarters of the Ramakrishna Mission, Kolkata, India, where he has been teaching Sanskrit, Vedantic scriptures, and Indian philosophy. Swamiji is an eminent and erudite scholar and is frequently invited for lectures on yoga, Vedanta, and traditional Hindu scriptures. His classes and lectures are available at the YouTube channel of the Vedanta Society of Northern California. And today he'll be speaking on making sense of Advaita. So, Maharaj, when you're ready, please.
Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmaswarupine avataravarishthaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha Sruti Purananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavat Padam Shankaram Lokashankaram. So I'm very happy to meet all of you from Vedanta Society of New York. I have the opportunity to visit that place twice during the time when Swami Tattwamayananda Maharaj was there. Now the subject in front of me is very interesting, making sense of Advaita. It is not a topic that we normally discuss in the course of teaching Shankara Bhashyas or Vartikas or other Prakarana Granthas, but it is very relevant to our own times because Advaita is one of the most misunderstood philosophical systems. Very often it is misinterpreted and misunderstood to be a kind of exposition of over asceticism, a world negating, a life negating way of life, a philosophy of life that refuses to accept the reality of the world in which we are living, the world of which we are a part, a world which we are interacting with every day, every moment in our life. This is a very common misunderstanding. And that's mostly because the fundamental truths enshrined in that tiny expression, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmaiva Napara. That's the central thesis of Advaita. In a nutshell, Brahman is the only absolute reality, and this world is Mithya, and the individual Jiva and Brahman are mutually identical. Now, we can understand when we talk about one absolute reality. Buddhism also talks about an absolute reality, Paramarthika Sattva. The Samburdhi Satyam and Paramartha Satyam in Shunyavada philosophy, Nagarjuna expounds in Chandrakirti's commentary. I mean, Samburdhi Satyam is the Vyavaharika world, the relative world, the everyday experience world in which we live. And there is a supreme transcendental reality, which is called Paramartha Sattva. Now, this is accepted in the Mahayana Buddhism, especially in the Shunyavada philosophy also. But the problem with Advaita is, when you talk about the world being Mithya, the real meaning or implication of the word Mithya is very rarely properly understood. Mithya doesn't mean absolute unreality, absolute non-existence. Mithya is not something that never exists at all. We never talk about anything that cannot even intellectually exist in our mind. You should be totally crazy to talk about things which cannot even be conceived intellectually. Absolutely impossible. So then why do we talk about the world being unreal? The world that we see every day in our life is changing. And what is changing is not absolutely real, but it is not absolutely unreal either. If it were absolutely unreal, it won't even become a subject of conversation in philosophy or in theology. If it were totally real, then the world would remain the same, and everyone knows, even a student going to kindergarten will know that every primary school student who studies physics will know this world is changing. The world is not what it was maybe 1 million years ago, and it won't be the same maybe after another million years. It is changing, constantly changing. So what does Advaita really tell you? Advaita tells you, well, there is something which is eternal, unchanging, which remains the same in the triple levels of consciousness, what we call Jagra, Swapna, Sushupti, or waking state, dream state, and deep sleep state, which is beyond all changes. All changes means 6 changes, Jayade, Asti, Vardhade, Vivarinamade, Apakshide, Vinaside. It means 6 changes, something that coming to existence, existing for some time, growing, evolving, decaying, and disappearing or dying out. Brahman is one reality which is unchanging, which is eternal, which is real with the capital letter R. And everything else is changing, relative, impermanent, but not unreal in the sense it is absolutely unreal. It is unreal only in the sense that it is not the absolute reality. So in that sense, Advaita is pure, simple common sense. Advaita is something that you can very easily relate to when you're working in your kitchen, when you're working in a factory, when you're studying in a school, when you're teaching in a university. You can very easily understand Advaita as pure, simple common sense. It is not something that an old Sanskrit Pandit sitting somewhere in a corner, reciting some books written maybe 600, 700 years back, explaining the meaning. It is true. That is the foundation, the philosophical foundation, the theoretical foundation, the theological foundation. But beyond all that, Advaita is simple, pure common sense that we can use in our everyday life. Advaita actually helps you to look at the world, to look at our life, to look at all of us from a higher perspective, from the perspective of the unchanging. And when you look at our own life from this higher perspective, then you will not be surprised that you fall sick one day, because you know sickness is natural for the human body, which is bound to change, which is changing all the time. Every cell is changing. You don't feel devastated when you become anxious. In fact, you cannot become really anxious if you really believe in Advaita. That's a reality. Because Advaita tells you, don't expect anything permanent from this impermanent world. When you expect something from an impermanent world, when you expect something permanent from an impermanent world, then you are in for disappointment. See, suppose you're traveling, let's say you travel from San Francisco, maybe New York to maybe you may be traveling to, let's say, Washington, D.C., driving, and you get information. GPS tells you that there's a chance that you may have to wait for 10 minutes, 15 minutes on the way. There's going to be a roadblock, there could be a traffic jam, and you expect it. And when you reach the place, 10 minutes, you know you have to wait there. You won't be anxious, you won't be worried, you won't be devastated because you are ready for this traffic problem. Like that, when we live in this world, when you know already that this world is imperfect and impermanent, this mind is bound to be happy now, unhappy at another time. So we need not worry about anything. So once we develop this common sense, it's called spiritual common sense. So Advaita has got a great spiritual value, a great psychological value. Of course, if we go to the philosophy of Advaita, and when you study from a traditional teacher, I found this in my own life. When you actually study Advaita from a traditional teacher, you have absolutely no doubt, no problem. But if you study Advaita from a translation, which tells you, Advaita tells you the world is unreal. That's what the book tells you. That's what English language can translate. No translation can do full justice to any original classical text in philosophy. You can't translate Kant into an Indian vernacular and depend upon the vernacular. You are bound to misunderstand what Kant means by the critical, by your reason, by what he writes in critical, your reason categorical imperative. You are bound to misunderstand. Like that, when you just read a book on Advaita, let us say the world is unreal, Advaita tells you, somebody should be crazy to say that you are unreal, I am unreal, the camera in front of me is unreal, the auditorium in which I'm sitting is unreal, the chair on which I'm sitting is unreal, totally crazy. That's precisely not what Advaita is telling. What Advaita tells you is that the table on which you're sitting is not going to be the same, let us say, after 1,000 years or after 1,000,000 years. Maybe 100 years back, this chair on which I'm sitting was in the form of a tree. 150 years back, it was in the form of a seed of another tree. So it's changing. That's what Advaita is talking about. The world is changing. The world is impermanent. The world is imperfect. Now, this is put in the language of Vedantins. Brahman is the only reality because it is Turiya, it is Sadvikara Atida, it is Avastatraya Abadhida, it is Kalatraya Atida. These are Sanskrit terms which I am not going to burden you with right now. But it means is Brahman is the one reality which is beyond time, space, and causation. Brahman is the one reality which is not going to die because it was never born to begin with. It doesn't take birth. It's not born. It doesn't come into existence. So it can never cease to exist. Because coming into existence, which means birth, which actually implies a transition from a state of empirical non-existence into a state of empirical existence. And Brahman is always there. And that absolute reality is the all-pervading, the immanent, the transcendental, absolute reality. And it is present in all of us. It's called Antaryami, etc. And we can actually experience this that is present in all of us. How do we experience this? We experience this when we practice certain ethical, moral values, which are called our sadhana sadhushtaya and sravana manana nididhyasana. I'm not going to those details of the technical subjects, which may be on another occasion. What it means is when we actually develop certain qualities, let's say a strong sense of what is real and what is unreal, and an aspiration to realize what is real, and a sense of detachment and renunciation, and a strong urge for liberation and enlightenment, and then feeding our mind with good spiritual food, what happens? Our mind begins to change, our mind becomes pure. When our mind becomes pure, what happens? This immanent reality, Atman, present in all of us, begins to manifest. It only needs a kind of rediscovery. It doesn't really manufacture. It is not something that you attain, that you create, that you manufacture. It is something which is already there, which we have to rediscover. And when we rediscover this, that experience expresses itself in the form of compassion for others and a deep sense of contentment, a kind of inner poise, serenity, and a kind of an inexplicable sense of satisfaction, contentment, inner perfection, inner fulfillment. This is what happens to a person who practices Advaita. Now, I shall say a few things about how to practice this in our everyday life. As I mentioned earlier, we do many things in our life. We talk, we act, we do our everyday duty, and then we think. All these can be given a spiritual orientation. That's what Advaita philosophers tell you. Everything can be given a spiritual orientation. What we do, that action can become a spiritually surcharged activity. That's why in Advaitic tradition, especially the commentaries of Bhagavad Gita, Shankaracharya's commentary is there, Madhusudana is there, and other commentators, there's an interesting philosophy of action and spirituality. How to combine action and spirituality, which gradually unfold if you read the Bhagavad Gita. At the beginning of our life, action and worship. At the second stage, action as worship. The third stage, worship alone. What it means is every activity that we do, every word we speak, every thought that we think can be given a spiritual orientation. Then what happens is our mind slowly becomes pure and pure. Our karma, vritti, samskara, sankalpa, vasana, chakram is called, Whatever we do becomes a tendency, an impression, a memory which remain accumulated in our mental system, and we act and talk and live according to under the influence of these samskaras, these impressions. These impressions can be purified when we do things with a sense of sanctity and sacredness. A sense of sanctity and sacredness, whether you're working in an office, doing work as a housewife, teaching in a university, all can become what Vedanta is called a yajna. Yajna means any action or any word, any thought, which is done with a noble motive. Yajna karma. That is the traditional commentators tell you. Any kind of activity which is done with a sense of sanctity and sacredness becomes yajna. And that kind of spiritualization of the secular or spiritualization of the secular activities, everyday activities, can become the royal highway to the unfoldment of this Atman that is present in all of us. We are, as I mentioned earlier, we are not creating or inventing something. We are only rediscovering something that we somehow forgot. That's why very often Advaita philosophers, especially those who came after Shankaracharya, in the post-Shankarite dialectical literature, you can find they frequently quote one interesting sutra of Patanjali Yoga Sutra. It is Nimittam Aprayojagam Prakrudinam Varanabedastu Kshetrigapada. It's a very interesting. Anyway, this comes in the Kaivalyapada, the 4th chapter of this Patanjali Yoga Sutra. What it means is very simple. Every activity is a way of removing the obstacle that stands in the way of unfolding our inner inherent divinity. And there's an example given, an illustration. Suppose a farmer wants to irrigate his field, and there's a river or maybe a well which is nearby, maybe half a mile away. He has to cut a canal to connect the river with the field which he wants to irrigate. Now what he does, he is removing the soil on the particular line, the direction of the canal. And once the soil is removed, the water flows from the river to the field. So actually, he did not really create a canal. What he did, he removed the soil. If you have got a granite block and you want to make a statue of Buddha, what do? You, if you're an expert, you chisel out all the unnecessary parts from the granite block, and that Buddha that is already inherent in the granite block comes into existence. Similarly, our activities, our words, our thoughts, when given a spiritual direction, then what happens is, then it helps us to manifest this divinity, the presence of this Atman within all of us. Now, this will help us to look at our everyday activities from a higher perspective. That means there are two ways of looking at the world. One is, and God, you may call. So one way of looking at God, you look at God through the eyes of the world. The other one is look at the world through the eyes of God. Now, if you look at God through the eyes of the world, you are in for trouble, because you are attributing to God all worldly aspects, all problems of the world, worries and anxieties and problems and all this. On the other hand, if you look at the world from a higher perspective, from a spiritual perspective, then you can look at your own life. You can look at your own worries. You can look at your own problems and then respond to those problems, solve those problems, but still remain detached from the problems. I mean, you'll be able to watch your own mind when you are getting angry. Then anger goes down. You will be able to watch your own mind when you become anxious, too anxious. Then anxiety goes down. When you become tired and sometimes bitter, when you watch your own mind and you understand, well, my mind is becoming bitter, then bitterness goes down. So what happens is, when you feel conflict, then you realize that you're becoming, you're facing conflicts, then conflicts go down. What happens is, when we can our own life as a witness and not as a participant, it's called in Sanskrit sakshi. It's called the word sakshi, witness. That is actually the philosophical, psychological background of mindfulness and so on. Many other, I'm not going into those details. So if we can look at our own life, our own mind, our own emotions and feelings as a non-participating witness and not as a participant, then you will be able to live in this world and still be outside the world. So that's why this sakshi is a very interesting term in Vedanta, in Advaita Vedanta. It is defined by Apaya Diksha, one of the great Sanskritists who made a great contribution to Bhavadi Prasthana and Vedanta tradition, Advaita tradition. He says, Bodhrutvad audasinyatvad sakshitvam. It's a very interesting definition. What it means is, when you want to be a witness, you should be aware of what you are a witness of. At the same time, you should not be a participant in that, of your witnessing. If you are going to court of law, you should have witnessed an event, then only you can give testimony. At the same time, you should not be participant. Similarly, if we can look at the world from this higher perspective, from a transcendental perspective, from the perspective of Brahman, the unchanging, the eternal, the permanent reality, and then watch and observe the impermanent, the ever-changing, the fleeting, the momentary experiences, then you will be able to take everything in our stream. This is the actual practical experience of Advaita Vedanta. Maybe if you go to India, to Benares or some other parts of India, tradition, Sanskrit, Pandit, Vedanta, they won't tell you, oh, you can't do this. But I tell you, they are doing an injustice to Advaita, because Shankaracharya himself did the same thing. What Shankara did, he actually gave a very modern, a revolutionary dimension to Advaita. He was a much greater revolutionary than Karl Marx or many of the modern radicals or liberal revolutionaries. The great Advaita philosophy was enshrined in the Rigveda Samhita, then Adhyatma Ramayana, then Yoga Vasishta, and then Ashtavakra Samhita, and many other books which are very theoretical. That Advaita was given a humanist interpretation, a humane dimension by Shankaracharya. So, what I want to tell you, Advaita can be very real. Advaita is not just a philosophical idealism. It is a beautiful symphony, a synthesis of the highest idealism and the highest realism. So, Advaita can become a psychological tool in our everyday life. Just look at our own life. Look at everything from the transcendental perspective, not from the empirical perspective. If you look at everything from the empirical perspective, what happens? We will look at everything as a permanent problem. If you have lost a job, we may imagine people get worried, they lose sleep, and they become anxious, they become sleepless because they lost the job, lost money, maybe lost health in some cases. Suddenly they become too worried. That's because they think that state of joblessness, a state of being unemployed, or maybe the state of having lost money, is a permanent, unchanging experience or reality. It is not. It is part of empirical life. You lose job today, tomorrow you get another job. You lose money today, and then you get money tomorrow. And you may lose your health today. After some years, you may regain your health. It's part of life. But when we are actually experiencing this, we forget that it is going to be different after some time. We wrongly attribute permanence to what is essentially impermanent. We wrongly attribute permanence to what we know to be impermanent, but somehow that creates problems, anxieties and worries. If you can always remember that our true nature is this absolute reality, Atman, that's our true reality, and being that absolute reality, being identified with that absolute reality. If you look at our own life, if you look at the whole world, you can look at this world as a witness, not as a participant. When we participate in everything, we are lost. When we observe our own mind, when we observe our own emotions, then we can detach, psychologically, we can detach ourselves from our own emotions. This idea actually comes from the Sakshi ideal of Advaita dialectics, and also from the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, you find that Sarvapriyananda Lakshanas, Arjuna's question to Lord Krishna, and Lord Krishna's answer as to what are the characteristics of a spiritually enlightened person. You find the second chapter from 55th verse to 72nd verse. In 18 verses, Lord Krishna actually gives an exposition of the characteristics of a Sthita Prajna, a state of being always the witness and not as a participant. And how do we actually look at the world as a witness when we identify ourselves as the permanent reality? Now, this state of experience is considered to be the state of the highest devotee. In the Bhagavata Purana, there is an interesting dialogue. The dialogue is not about Advaita really. It is the 11th skandha, it comes, 11th section, 11th book it comes. This dialogue between 9 sages and the philosopher king. Kavir Andariksha Prabuddha Pipalayana Abhigotro Divilas Chamasa Karabhajana. These are 9 sages. Don't worry about the names. Kavi, Hari, Andariksha, Prabuddha, Pipalayana, Abhihotra, Drumila, Chamasa, Karabhajana. Well, you know, worry about this. These are the names of 9 sages and a great philosopher king, like the philosopher king portrayed in Plato's Republic. Now, his name is Janaka. when these 9 sages visited the king in his palace, the king puts many questions to these sages. And one important question that he puts to these sages, one of the sages, is, who is an ideal devotee of God? Now, and who is actually practicing spirituality in his everyday life? It's a big question. Among many other questions, the king puts one question each to each of the 9 sages. When the question is put to the sage Antariksha as to who is the actual practitioner of spirituality, in fact, Advaita, that's what we are going to discuss in everyday life. The answer given is Sarvabhudeshu yat pasyet bhagavad bhavam atmanaha bhudani bhagavadi atmani esha bhagavadottama. That is, the answer is very simple. The one who sees the presence of God in everyone and the presence of everyone in God is the highest practitioner of practical Vedanta and the highest devotee. This is the answer. Now, how do we do that? When we actually practice Advaita, on the one hand, we'll be able to enjoy a tremendous experience of contentment, peace, and inner fulfillment. Our interaction with others, our behavior with others also will undergo a complete transformation. What happens? Compassion, broad-mindedness, humility, all these characteristics become natural because we'll be seeing in everyone the presence of the divine. I will be seeing everyone in the divine reality. This idea behind. That's why Shankaracharya says, Advaita has no quarrel with anyone. Anyone who practices Advaita cannot quarrel. So there's a verse in the Mandukya Karika which is well known. So Siddhanta Vyavasthasu Dvaitino Nishchidadudham Parasparam Viruddhindi Tayyarem Na Viruddhini. It's a very simple verse. What it means is, those who practice Advaita, those who practice this highest philosophy, in their everyday life, they cannot hurt anyone. They cannot consider anyone as alien to himself. In fact, they cannot do any harm to anybody because they see the whole humanity as one spiritual family. You cannot hurt your own body. You will feel the pain. Similarly, we can't do any harm to anybody. So this is the other side of Advaita. On the one hand, is the highest metaphysical system. On the other hand, it is a combination of the highest realism and highest idealism. Secondly, on the one hand, it helps us to live in this world, but still take all problems in our stream and remain detached, enjoying tremendous peace of mind and contentment within. At the same time, the interaction with others will be one of compassion, broad-mindedness, and joy. Now, without this higher idealism, without some kind of spiritual ideal, whatever other skills we may have will not help us to enjoy this inner poise and contentment. That's an important thing to remember. You can see this happening. In fact, again, I have to quote one ancient Sanskrit verse. It's a very famous one. Yepuman adhimethavi chadurna mekam asnude atpayu anabadhyova daridra patitopiva. What it says is very interesting. A person who has accomplished something very great in his life, maybe a big industrial captain, maybe a big scientist, big a celebrity in any area for the matter. If that person doesn't have a spiritual ideal to follow, a spiritual ideal to practice, what happens is there'll be one serious problem in his or her life. That's what happened. We can see the lives of great musicians, artists, painters, novelists, creative writers. You can find they accomplish great things, but frequently they often fall victims to some problem or other, which I'm not going to elaborate. It could be alcoholism, it could be drug addiction, whatever it is. So what happens is, when our mind is focused too much on one ideal, when we work too hard to attain perfection in one area, what happens is our mind gets slightly imbalanced. And that's why a great musician, after a big performance, he has to let off the steam and he has to maybe to forget himself. This happens very often to great celebrities. That's because mind is empty somewhere. And that empty part can be filled up only by a great spiritual idea. So what we should do, we should look at everything we do from a higher transcendental perspective. Then what happens? We will be able to enjoy peace of mind within. At the same time, we'll be able to live in this world with perfect happiness, contentment, and joy. This is the the practical side of Advaita Vedanta. That's why Shankaracharya, he did not stop with writing what could be called the most profound philosophical classics maybe the world has ever seen. Big pundits spend long years to study what a boy of 16 years had already finished writing, by the time he reached 16th year. That is Shankaracharya. Shankaracharya is considered to be one of the most hardworking persons the world has ever seen. Within 32 years, he traveled all over India 4 times. He founded 10 monastic orders, and you should remember, Ignatius Loyola founded only 1 monastic order. Shankaracharya is the founder of 10 monastic orders, and he is the author of the most profound philosophical works in Sanskrit language, and also he is the author of the most moving devotional poetry in Sanskrit language, 65 great devotional hymns. And again, he has installed temples all over India. In spite of all that, what he did, he not only built a huge edifice, but he also gave us a long ladder. You can climb this big building. You can reach the top of the hill of Advaitic experience with the help of this ladder. What is the ladder? Karma Yoga. So, if we can bring in an element of sanctity and sacredness to every activity that we do in our life, every word, every thought, then what happens in course of time, we'll be able to experience the reality of this Atman within us. Karmanishthayaha chitta siddharena purushartha na swadandriyana jnana nishtha swadandriyana purushartha anyana apeksha Shankaracharya says. So it's just like a thread that we can follow, and if we work hard, we reach the top of this the highest edifice of Advaita. That so he not only built a huge edifice, but he also gave us a ladder that we can use to climb the top of the building. So Advaita, on the one hand, is the highest spiritual philosophy. On the other hand, it is pure, simple common sense. Pure spiritual common sense. What we already know, what every primary school student will know, that's what Advaita is talking about. This world, our body, all that we see around us is changing. Will not be the same tomorrow, maybe after some years. This world was not the same maybe a few millions of years ago. It will be different after a few more millions years. The world is changing. Totally different, unrecognizable. It's a fact which everyone knows. But the point is, that fact we forget in our everyday life. And when Vedantists tell you Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, we think it is something life negating, world negating, totally unrealistic. But actually, it is the most simple, most commonplace spiritual, a piece of spiritual wisdom. The world is changing. Everything won't be the same all the time. It's a fact which everyone knows, but somehow we forget it. When we go to the crematorium, when we find maybe our friend has died recently, maybe it can happen, when the body is pushed the tube, then when you come back, maybe for a day or two, we may remember, but then again, we forget that the world is not going to change. I'm not going to change. This body is going to remain the same. Everything is going to remain the same. We may know intellectually, but emotionally we may forget. That's why there's a big conflict between what we know intellectually and what our mind is willing to accept in our everyday life. A big conflict, a wide gap between what we know intellectually very well, and what our mind is willing to accept as a fact in our everyday life. Advaita is really a fact, is a fact of our everyday life that we can experience if we can turn the flashlight into our own life. So I think we'll have a long interaction. I would rather stop right now. We have about 20 minutes for interaction. If you don't have questions, I'm ready to continue. Most welcome.
Swamiji, we already have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
I will read it aloud. It's a question from Girish.
Yeah.
Don't you first have to be enlightened to detach from your emotions? Deliberately acting as a witness seems artificial and intellectual exercise.
Yeah. You're right, and also you're wrong. You're right, because the highest degree of detachment comes only for an enlightened person. But at the same time, without practicing it, you are not going to get enlightened. It's a fact. Without really practicing it, you are not going to get enlightenment. And without getting enlightenment, you are not going to get perfection in that detachment. It's a fact. So what we do, that's why these 7 disciplines are given in Advaita philosophy. It's very practical. It's called sadhana sadhushtaya. I mean, nitya nitya vastu vega iha mutra bharabhoga viraga samadhi sukha sampati mumukshuttam sravanam manam nididhyasana. 7 disciplines. Very simple. One is, let us accept for a fact that the world is changing. And let us at least intellectually accept the fact that there is something that's unchanging. And then we should have a strong attachment towards what is real, and an ability to detach ourselves from what is obviously unreal. And then what happens when we do this, naturally you will develop a lot of self-restraint, kind of self-control, and also you have a strong urge for, let us say, hunger for enlightenment. Actually, our commentators will tell you that when a person actually develops a strong desire for higher wisdom, if you're living in the 21st century, in the midst of all these complexities, job, competition, many problems, not problems, but hard realities. In the midst of all these, one day when we return to home, we sit for some time. Well, where does it all end? Should I go for something much more lasting? May listen to good music, not violent music, but something respectable kind of music, or listen to some wonderful songs or devotional songs or anything. Then suddenly you feel there is something much more than what I'm actually doing every day. Something higher. You may read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, many of you may read the Sermon on the Mount, you may read, say, maybe Dhammapada or any Bhagavad Gita or Upanishads. We listen to some of the ideas from these books. Then you may feel that there is something much more than what I am actually looking for in my everyday life. That feeling comes. And that's the beginning of this detachment. That is a detachment, really. But at the end of it, when you become a Buddha, there is another kind of detachment. But you cannot always begin practicing detachment after becoming a Buddha, because you are not going to become a Buddha without practicing detachment. So the fact is, at the beginning, when we develop a strong desire for higher wisdom, a hunger for something higher and noble, that's what is happening in America right now. When Swami Vivekananda came, Transcendentalism was there, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, Christian Science, and many movements were there. People were actually looking for something real, capital letter R, transcendental. When they listened to Swamiji, they felt they could connect with Swami Vivekananda. Because the background was already, the psychological background, intellectual landscape was there. Like that, in our everyday life, when we develop an urge for something higher, it's called mumukshutvam at the beginning, in its most infantile aspect. It's called the mumukshutvam, means a strong urge for liberation. It was this urge for liberation that enabled Buddha to leave his home, walk 1200 miles, reach Bodh Gaya, and sit under a tree, and he eventually became Buddha. When he left his palace, he was not Buddha, but he had the detachment. So when we actually listen to a wonderful talk, when we develop a hunger, a thirst for higher spiritual wisdom, that is also the beginning of detachment. Without that detachment, you will not be able to reach the detachment that comes automatically to an enlightened person. And then listening to higher ideas, thinking, contemplating on higher ideas, this will naturally reinforce our hunger for higher values. And then detachment or non-attachment from our own lower self comes automatically in spite of itself. It doesn't require an effort. It's a natural consequence. It is the result of a deliberate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Swamiji. Question from Cordelia. How can one practice seeing the divine in everyone you interact with, especially those who annoy you?
It's a problem, really. It's easy to be friendly with people who are not naturally friendly with us, compassionate with us. But what about those who are different? Well, we may have to respond to certain situations to protect ourselves, to deal with a difficult situation. We may have to act, we may have to be proactive, but we can respond to situations without hating anyone, without hatred, because hatred eventually hurts ourselves. That's the main problem. When you may have to respond to situations, we may have to react to situations, and sometimes we may have to react in a very unpleasant way as a natural requirement for self-preservation. But that can be done without hatred, without animosity towards anyone, because hatred and animosity can hurt ourselves spiritually and psychologically. So there also we are actually practicing a degree of non-attachment or detachment. Yeah.
Swamiji, question from Vishwanath. You had mentioned audacinium. This is generally translated as indifference, which seems to imply escapism. Is there a better English translation to convey the intended sentiment?
Yeah. It is not indifference. It is in that context in which it is used in that. Actually, I was quoting a definition from Appaya Dekshida. Audasinitva, bodhrutva, audasinitva. That's meaning. Audacity here means non-involvement. That's the meaning. Just like, if you want to be a witness in a court of law, you should not have participated in that event or crime of which you are a witness. So to qualify for being a witness, you should be non-involved. At the same time, you should be able to explain it. So you should be aware of it. So that is bodhrutva. So non-involvement is the real implication as far as English language can go to be translating out the senior. Not indifference. Indifference is never implied in any of the scriptures.
Swamiji, can I ask the next question?
Yeah, please.
Yes. It is from Pradeep. Impermanence and change imply the flow of time. What is the Advaitic interpretation of time?
Yeah, Advaita doesn't accept time as something permanent. Time is within relativity. What Maya is translated as relativity, Maya Mithya. What is relative? You know, time is actually, at a philosophical level, you know, time is only our imagination, really speaking. What we call time, let us say, it depends upon the amount of time that Earth takes to go around its own axis, the total time it takes to go around the sun. And suppose there are planets farther away from the sun, farther than the Earth, how the concept of time will be different. In the Puranas, you find our 1,000 years will be equivalent to one day in the life of Devas. So you find, of course, these are mythological stories, but the idea is, so time is only a concept. It is not an entity. And time is often something that we measure between two events. So again, you have to remember, it is not an absolute concept. As I mentioned, the time that we understand by the word in our everyday conversation is only related to the earth and the time it takes around to go around its own axis, the time to take around the sun, and so on. And if you can think of other planets, other living beings, their idea of time will be different. They would accept our time. So it is very, very fluid. It is imaginary. It's like a line that you draw on water. It really doesn't exist. Yeah, thank you.
Swamiji, question from Kiran. Could you please elaborate on karma nishta?
Yeah. Now, in the Gita, of course, this is based on Gita. Gita, there are 4 levels of karma mentioned. One is total absence of karma. That was what was the problem with Arjuna in the first chapter, which Arjuna expresses in the language of duplicity and hypocrisy. And there is sakama karma. It is far better to do something with a strong motive, strong ambition, a strong sense of purpose than doing nothing. That is sakama karma. The third stage, there is Nishkama Karma. If we can do our work with the same enthusiasm, with the same efficiency, with the same zeal and effectiveness, but without a selfish motive, it's called Nishkama Karma. That is still higher. And the highest state is Karma Nishtha, when doing everything properly with the highest degree of efficiency and effectiveness, but without a selfish motive. When this becomes natural to us, it is called karma nishtha. So many of the great spiritual giants the world has produced, they were you don't find a single spiritual teacher who was inefficient. If you look at the life of a Vivekananda, a Shankaracharya, Sri Ramakrishna, or a Buddha, they had or Christ for the matter, take any great spiritual epoch maker, they had so much of efficiency. That's why we are talking about their teachings today, 2000 years later, or hundreds of years later, we are still studying their teachings. We are drawing inspiration from their life. So, efficiency, enthusiasm, effectiveness, with all zeal, at the same time, without any selfish motive. This is the highest state. It is natural for every great spiritual person. Of course, there were a few saints who just lived in a cave, maybe in some caves and forests, who meditated, but their meditation also had made great contribution to the spiritual wealth of human civilization, indirectly. So in other words, karma nishtha is that state where this becomes natural. Highest efficiency, highest degree of enthusiasm and working for the good of others, at the same time without any selfish motive. this becomes natural, then it becomes nishtha. That's called.
Okay, I think we have exhausted
Thank you.
the questions for the evening, Maharaj. Thank you so very much. On behalf of everybody here attending on the Vedanta Society of New York, on behalf of Swami Sarvapriyananda ji himself and everybody else attending, thank you so much for spending your valuable time in giving this discourse, this wonderful discourse, blending concepts from Advaita, Vedanta, but also freely blending in karma and bhakti in a beautiful manner, like Adi Shankaracharya himself. So thank you so much, Swamiji, and we hope to see you in person when in better times. Hopefully, you will come again and visit us like you did when Swami Tattwamayananda Maharaj was here. We look forward to those times. Thank you again, and thank you.
Thank you.